This computer. I am now recording. I will share my screen and we'll get started. I got to expand it out here, and now I will share my screen. Yay! And I will bring up the first document. Here we go. That's a lot of stuff.
Dr. Lamb, and just to make the students aware, first of all, we thank them for coming on board tonight. I know the weather is rough everywhere, and just all of you just be careful no matter what you have to do tomorrow, because I understand it's going to be pretty bad tomorrow as well. But thank you, and I want to brag on the students. Dr. Brevis and I were talking today, and I have spoken with Dr. Hamilton. I'm very, very pleased with the progress that they have made up to this point. Most of them have cleared task 2 and moving already into task 3 and doing a good job with getting prepared for task 3 this week. So we're very pleased with this group of students. They're doing well.
Yes, and Dr. Lamb, Dr. Crawford and I have talked and said we have had the finest work, in addition, the finest peer reviews, where they have really taken those seriously. They have been reading their peers' work. They have been given thorough and descriptive and specific feedback that really does help facilitate growth.
Great.
So just kudos to the group. And just because we bragged on you, that means you only can get better. You can't backslide on us. Don't backslide on us. But tonight is going to be our last Thursday night for a while, and this gives you a time to do your independent work and to work with your Zoom groups with the things that you've got to do collaboratively. But tonight is a special treat. Dr. Lamb's going to share with us his expertise in the study of EVOS, and then we've asked Dr. Hamilton, Dr. Crawford, and Dr. Tobias, who are acting principals, sitting principals, to share just briefly, how they use it as a principal to gauge their school and student achievement and to move forward. So Dr. Lamb, I'm going to turn it over to you at this time.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to dive right into EVOS. EVOS is value added. For the first 20 years in North Carolina and South Carolina, we had comparative accountability models. Going back to the basic ed plan, 1983, A Nation at Risk, the book came out that said our students aren't learning anything. In response to that, in 84, 85, many states put in basic education plans. This is what students must know to be getting a basic education. They developed state tests, North Carolina EOG and EOCs. And we started collecting data on what students knew or didn't know. Well, the first thing that we had to do is somebody said, well, what are they supposed to know? What is a basic education? So from the years 85 to 89, most states, including North Carolina, developed a comprehensive state curriculum. We called it the Standard Course of Study, big, thick, white notebooks. Some of you might be old enough to remember those that said, this is what a basic education is. And we started testing those students to see if they, in fact, had learned that. It was a comparative accountability, and we compared high-level kids with low-level, rich neighborhoods to poor. And we did that for about 20 years, and somebody said, wait a minute, said, the most important thing should be is a kid growing, is a growth model accountability. And so the state of North Carolina and others paid SAS Institute out of the Research Triangle to develop a value-added model that isolates all the variables, the independent variables of a child, and predicts the dependent variable, what score they would make in order to show a year's growth. Now, why this is important to you as emerging administrators is when you start working with your faculties on EVOS, they have preconceived notions that are wrong. They believe that some kids can make growth better than others, that there's inherent value in having one group over the other, that it's harder to get growth out of this group. What EVOS does, it's a regression equation that allows for all those independent variables. Now, we didn't pull it out of the air. we took 20 years of data, and now we're up to 30 years of data. And we did a analysis of variance so that we would know what those independent variables, the strength of those in determining what test scores would be. So let me walk you through the lesson plan here. And yes, it will be available after tonight. I do not put this out until I explain it to you, because people take it and run with it the wrong way sometimes, and you'll see that in just a minute. So it's a value-added model where we're trying to isolate the actual value that a teacher adds in that classroom. That's what we're trying to do, is determine how much value a teacher adds. So everything else is controlled for. So we're trying to determine if a child makes a year's growth. And we're looking to see that 85% of the teacher students make growth, and 85% of the teachers in a building make growth. So you can meet expectation, you can not meet, you can exceed, but it's all based on, does 85% of the students in a teacher's classroom make growth, and do 85% of the teachers in a building make growth? So that's the metric that we start with. Analysis of variance is we take all those standardized test scores for all those years. We know all the independent variables for a kid, and we look at how much variance each one of those variables has in their actual test score, which would be, and we're trying to predict what score they should make on a test to show a year's growth. That's what we're trying to do. And so it's a simple regression equation where all 10 of the independent variables, we add those together, we get the dependent variable. And so now, SAS is a private company. They don't release their formula other than it's a regression equation. But here is my best guesstimate from research and working in this for a number of years as to what each of these independent variables, the weight that they bring in a child's test score. Now, this is not opinion. It's not some political agenda. This is what 30 years worth of test scores tell us what factors into a child's score. And so here they are. Race is 30%. Mother's education is 15. Father's income is 15. Teacher is 10. School district is 5. School is 5. Grade is 5. Age is 5. Gender is 5. And previous test score is 5. When we add all those together, that's 100% of the variance in a child's test score from those independent variables. Now, as you can see, there's only two things that the school can control. That is the age and grade and the teacher. So we know, why do you think we've started RTI and MTSS? We know that retaining kids is not good for their scores. And so we've stopped that. And so the only other thing that we can control is the teacher in that classroom. So we're trying to figure out how much value that teacher brings to that classroom. Now, school administrators must recognize that quality teachers can contribute up to 10% of the variance in test scores. But you got to continually provide staff development. We're going to get into that in the APTEL, come up next, where we provide whole group, small group, PLC, and one-on-one instruction for our teachers. All that has to factor into our plan. I have called my plan, this is the plan that you will develop in the APTEL for your professional development plan. I call mine MTSS for teachers, but it utilizes all facets of staff development. Linda Darling-Hammond is the guru, in order to empower teachers in their classroom, and that's Todd Whitaker. I mean, that's Robert Marzano using best practices, and it utilizes the work of Todd Whitaker, who says that, you know, the best way to empower teachers is to have, the first level is teaching other teachers. And that's what this model does. But we have to have a professional development model to work with our teachers to get them better. We don't, you know, we get back to getting the right teachers on the bus. Well, rarely do you get to hire all the teachers at a school. You inherit them. So they're the best ones you got, so you've got to make them better through professional development using whole group, small group PLC, and one-on-one. And so here is my model, but let's dive into EVOS. The regression equation is not connected to EVOS numbers. It's how the target raw score is calculated to determine if a kid has made a year's of growth. So here's an example. I'll pull this one straight out of CMS. So we got a third grade math EOG exam. That's end of grade, third grade. There's 180 questions on the exam. So the total raw score that any student could achieve would be 180. The question is, what score out of 180 would represent a year's growth for that particular child? The growth model is dependent on each individual kid. They have a predictor score that says if they score this many, they have made a year's growth. Well, how do we come up with that score? So the whole point of tonight's presentation for me is that you can explain to teachers that everything is controlled for except the teacher. If a kid doesn't make it, it's because of the teacher unless there's some anomaly that has occurred. And so each individual child has a growth score that's individual to them to show a year's growth. How do we get that score? Should it be 120? Should it be 150? Should it be 50? There's a formula for how that works. And we go back to that regression equation that we developed out of that analysis of variance. So here we go. I'll jump right in. Jamar is a third grade student in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. His independent variables are, he is black. He gets 20 out of 30. White would be 30. Hispanic would be 15. That's what test scores tell us. That's not got anything to do with race. It has to do with previous test scores. His mother has less than a high school diploma. That's 5 out of 15. Beyond a 4-year degree would be 15. No father in the home, 0 out of 15. Father's income in excess of 150 would be 15. Why are those so important? If dad makes enough money, mom stays at home, works with child, seat time, merging readers, those kinds of things. Teacher is considered to be 10. CMS is a high wealth district, that would be 5. If it was a low wealth district, it would be 2. The school the child was in, Billingsville, was a takeover school, 0. A high growth school would be a 5. Grade 5, he's not a repeater, so he's on grade level. However, he is 9 years old. He was developmentally delayed, didn't start school till the age of 6, so he gets 3 out of 5 in that category. Gender 5, female would be 4, difference because this is a math test. It'd be exactly the opposite if it were a reading test. Boys score better on math, girls score better on reading. That's not my opinion, that's data. Previous scores too, he was not on grade level according to M-class data coming out of 2nd grade. So his equation looks like this. 20 plus 5 plus 0 plus 10 plus 5 plus 0 plus 5 plus 3 plus 5 plus 2 equals 55%. Total raw score is 180. We multiply that by the 0.55. He's got to score 99 to show a year's growth. Out of 100, he's got to get 99 out of 180 questions right to show a year's growth. That's his individual score. That's the way EVOS works. Works that way for every child. We take the independent variables that are all known about every child that we have in public school. We know those 10 independent variables about them. We simply do the algorithm. We work out the regression equation, and we multiply that percentage by the total number that possible, the raw score, to come up with the number. So Jamar has to get 99 of the 180 questions correct to show a year's growth. It's individualized for every child. So the point for you as emerging administrators, when you have teachers who say, I don't want to do this, or I want that group, or I don't want to teach this, but it's the same for everybody. Every child is different. And making growth, you have the same potential to make growth with every child that walks in the building, because every child is not held to an unreasonable standard. Their projected score fits their profile, who they are. So that's what EVOS is. This way we can, if a child doesn't make it, we can isolate that the teacher didn't make the 10 points. We know that that teacher did not add enough value for that student to make growth. And you said, well, Dale, they got to make 10 out of 10. No. Usually the teacher's got to add at least 5. The most that they can add is 10, but you got to be a pretty good teacher to add 5. And so again, our whole idea here is every child must show growth. Every teacher has to add value. All children have the ability to learn, maybe not at the same time or the same capacity right away. But the notion here is that you as principal of the school have to be able to look at the EVOS data and put your teachers where they need to be. And you can't let all these preconceived notions that teachers have that it's inherently fair or unfair to have certain groups of kids. And you need to remind teachers that fair is an early adolescent concept. That fair in the adult world is where you go in the fall of the year to get a corn dog and ride the Ferris wheel. There is no fair in the adult world. So that's the argument that I always make with them is it's not about fair. All right. We're talking about equity here. We're talking about being equitable. All right. So now you've got a general overview. Again, I will post this. Now that you kind of understand how it works, I will post this. But you've got a general overview that EVOS is about measuring the effectiveness of teachers, how much value they add. That's your job. Remember, your job as a school administrator is not about what to teach. I've even got that in here. Don't get caught up in these discussions about Common Core and all these other things of that nature. Your job is how to teach, not what to teach. That's already been determined for you. And so I think I've got that. Let's see. Yeah. Executive leaders must understand that curriculum at the school level is all about how to teach, not what to teach. Don't get sidetracked into political debates such as Common Core. Focus on improving instructional delivery, best practices. That's our job, is instructional delivery, not to figure out what to teach, but how to teach. And if you understand that, you're way far down the road. You're taking those first steps to changing your lens to that of an administrator. We don't debate what to teach. That's handed to us. Here's the state curriculum. Teach this. Your job is to make sure it's delivered effectively. So if you'll remember that, you're further down the road as well. All right, so I've got 2 presentations pulled up. Who's going to go next?
Dr. Lamb, I'm sorry. I have a question about this. So one of the things that we found out last year in our school was our data coach came over and talked to us about stay nines.
Mm-hmm.
And because one of the areas I supported was not an EOG area.
Right.
The data coach to create these stay nines that show predictability about where students will fall in this stay nine based on, I guess, that tells you how they're going to perform or predict how they're going to perform on a test.
Right.
And so one of the, I guess you would say, arguments that came up is if I'm one teacher and I have 25 students in my class, and the data coach divided the stay nines up into 8 stay nines.
Right.
Have 1/4 of my class is in stay nine groups 1 through 3. Another 1/4 is in 3 through 4. Another 1/4 is in 4 through 5, and the last 1/4 is in 6 through 8. And I'm generalizing this. Versus if there's another class and another class where the students have been assigned, there's only maybe 2 stay nines versus all these different stay nines, different groups.
Right.
I know it still deals with how the teacher instructs in terms of trying to meet the needs of all the students, but as a principal, is it equitable to place students?
Have I lost y'all, or did we lose Lanika?
We lost Lanika.
Okay. This is a Dr. Hamilton. I'm going to give my response. Dr. Hamilton's actually going to cover this. I saw this, I think, in her presentation. The question is when we put students in classes, do we put students from several different stay nines, 8 different categories, or do we try to keep it to 2 or 3? Is it equitable? Well, it would be equitable if everybody had 8 different stay nines in their class. I'm not sure that's the best practice, though. And so the question comes in practice, how do you put this in place in practice? And that's what our 2 resident principals are going to talk to you about tonight. Me personally, because we do encourage differentiated instruction in our classes, I don't want to see just 1 or 2 stay nines, because then that becomes the old Bluebirds, Robins, and Brothers grouping that we used to have. My general rule of thumb is not to have more than 4, between 2 and 4. That's just mine from the data that says that when you have more than 4, you lose your effectiveness. But I don't want to have much less than 4, because if I have that, then I have ability group them into the Bluebirds, Robins, and Buzzards again, like when I was in school. And you can believe I wasn't a Bluebird.
We already know where I am on that, so go ahead.
All right, so is this, Dr. Hamilton, are you going next?
I'll go. My turn. I'm up. Okay, so I'm not as sophisticated with EVOS as Dr. Lamb, but I can just tell you what I know, or what I think I know. Let's put it that way. And this is going to be important for you. So in EVOS, you're going to see 2 things, a growth index and a growth measure. So I'm going to talk to you about the growth index. So make sure when you're looking at EVOS that you're looking between those 2 things. But there's one thing consistent with EVOS. They're going to color code for you. And if something is color coded in blue, then that means that that teacher, that group, that whoever you're looking at, there is significant evidence that the school's students have made more progress than the state growth or the state average. So they have made a greater growth index of 2.0 or greater. So they have, we're going to call that exceeded growth, and their color is going to be blue. And if their color is green, so that's a -2 to a +2, there is evidence from the data that the school's students have made progress similar to the state growth standard or the state average, and they're going to fall between a -2 and a +2. And then if they're in the red, which is less than a -2, that is significant evidence that the school's students have made less progress than the state's growth. So it is very important that you understand that color coding and where that falls on that number line about exceeding growth, meeting growth, and not meeting growth. So that's the first thing you want to know. And so then as we scroll on down, this is a new report that just came out, I believe in 2018 or 19. It's hard for me to remember anything in these times in which we're living. But if you go to reports, if you have to have an administrator view of EVOS for this, but when you go to reports, you're going to go to growth of student groups. Now the view I'm going to give you is the growth of student groups by subject area, and you can look at the student groups. It gives you the very same information. And because this is elementary that I'm looking at, we're going to look at math, reading, or science. So if we'll scroll on down just a little, here are our student groups. So let's look at these student groupings just in a little bit of detail. So we already know, because of what we just learned, that if it's blue, that means we exceeded growth expectations. If it's green, that means we met. Now back to what Dr. Lamb said, EVOS is going to level the playing field for you. So you don't have some students that are easier to grow or some students that cannot be grown. So let's look at this very top example right here. The very top example, student group, academically gifted. Okay, their overall growth index was a +2.92. So let's call that a +3, just because sometimes I like to round these things up. So in 3rd grade, this group met the growth index of a 0.43, so they met. 4th and 5th grade, they had a +2.26 and a +2.06. So they exceeded growth. And I know you've all probably heard that old adage about you can't grow smart children. There's nowhere for them to go. Well, this right here disproves that for you. Then in this next example that we have, our economically disadvantaged children, the 3rd grade was a -1.28, the 4th grade a -0.33, and the 5th grade a +1.16. Then our Hispanic children. So you can see that those things are there. This is great for you when you're looking at your PLCs and you want to disaggregate data in your PLCs, and you need to determine which groups of students you really need to work on the most. Ask your principal if you can view this under reports, school growth of student groups, and that is going to give you a breakdown by grade level and by student group that will help you in your disaggregation of data with your PLC, with your most pressing need. So you can really, really see what it is that you want to look at. So back to the Stay 9 question and those kinds of questions, if we can just scroll on down for just a minute, and we'll just hit on that for just a minute. So in school accountability growth, now when you're a teacher, yes, it's very important. Your growth is very important to you. When you become an administrator, your school growth is equally important to you. So in the elementary school, and this just clipped right out of EVOS, and now this does explain that in 17-18 in high school, biology is no longer included in the overall school accountability growth. But in elementary school, the school accountability growth, even though our kindergarten, first and second grade teachers have their own EVOS data, the overall school accountability growth are based on your EOG data for math, reading, and science. So you have to have at least 2 data points for children for them to have a growth measure. So in 3rd grade, you have your, typically, in a typical year, you have your BOG, beginning of year in 3rd grade. Then you have your EOG. So typically in 3rd grade, math doesn't count towards your growth, but reading does. So that's a 1/6 of your accountability growth. Then in 4th grade, you have reading and math because they've already had the reading and math test in 3rd grade, so now in 4th grade. So that's a 1/3 of your school's growth. And then in 5th grade, you have reading, math, and science. And even though they haven't had the science test before, there's some kind of calculation they use based on the reading test that they can make a prediction about what the children should be making on their science. So your 5th grade is going to count for half of your school's accountability growth. Half. You have 6 growth measures and that's going to count towards your school growth in elementary. 5th grade has 3 of those tests typically. So decisions. Last Friday, I lost 2 teachers to involuntary transfers because of numbers in the district. So I had 2 options. I could either break up a 3rd grade class. All my 3rd grades had 15 children each. So I could break up a 3rd grade class and put 4 children in the other classrooms and they would still have 19 or 20 each. Or I could break up the 5th grade class of the 5th grade teacher that I lost, put those children in the other 5th grade classrooms, and now they're going to have 27, 28, 29 children each. So you know what I did? I broke up that 3rd grade class, gave my 3rd grade teachers 19 and 20 each, so they still came in under the class size cap, and then I kept my 5th grade low because my data show over the last 14 years in the same building that every year that my 5th grade teachers are able to have lower class sizes, that not only is their proficiency higher, but also that their growth in EVOS is higher. And that's going to be something with EVOS. It's going to be hard for you to get across to your staff. They can't unwrap their mind around proficiency. They think when children are proficient, then that means they grew. That does not necessarily mean that in EVOS, and that's a paradigm that's hard to change. So this year is an atypical year in elementary. So 3rd grade, we're going to take the BOG when they come back to school, even though they can take it all the way up to like January, which is crazy, but okay. And then in 4th grade, because they didn't have a 3rd grade reading, nor did they have a 3rd grade math at the end of the year, but they had their 3rd grade BOG when they were in 3rd grade. So 4th grade's only going to have reading this year. And this year, 5th grade, because they've had a 3rd grade reading and math, and then they'll have science. So this year, 5th grade's going to count 3/5. 4th and 3rd will only count 1/5. So that's even more important, that decision that I made about which class sizes to break up and what to do when I had to disband a class is even more important right now, because now 5th grade really does count 60%. And then the last thing that I think you can find very, very useful to you for your PLCs and looking at your most pressing need, there's a decision dashboard under school reports. And so I just pulled this one up because I thought it was a good comparison for us from what we looked at a few minutes ago. So this shows math in grades 4 and grade 5. And this has the quintiles, which is a 5th, it breaks it into 5th. So I didn't have enough students in quintile 1 and 2 to be statistically significant enough to have a report. So we'll see in 5th grade that the middle quintile, 3rd, next to the highest, 4th, they exceeded growth because these colors stick with us. The highest group met, and the same thing in the 4th grade, the highest group met. So I could think to myself, well, a lot of the children making 5s are probably in AIG, but if I remember back in this presentation just a little while ago when I was showing you the student groups, we remember that my 4th and 5th grade students in AIG exceeded growth with a plus 2.26 and a plus 2.06. So when I come back down here and I think about that, then I have to think, then what has pulled us down to not exceed growth may be the students who are making level 5s, but are not identified and academically gifted. So that would be a subgroup. If I was looking for a most pressing need when I want to think about my EVOS growth, that would be a group of children that I would really want to look at, and what do I need to do to extend their critical thinking and their opportunities in math to help them exceed growth.
Dr. Hamilton or Dr. Lamb, this is Joel Rose. I have 2 questions, if I may.
Go ahead.
The growth index is how much they actually grew. That's not the target. Is that correct?
Dr. Hamilton, are you still with us?
I'm with you. I can't really answer that question. I just know that it's reported out in growth index, and that's what we have to go by. That's what I can tell you.
So ask your question again, Joel. I'll answer your question. I know the answer.
On the EVOS report, when we see the growth index,
Right.
is that how much a particular group grew the previous year?
It's not a group.
No, it's not. Again, it's not a group.
It's listed beside of subgroups.
It's how much a subgroup, but what we're talking about on the index here is a range,
Mm-hmm.
and so it gives us a range for that subgroup.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct.
Okay, so
It gives us a range for the subgroup.
the second part of the question is, I know that between a -2 and a +2 is typical, I guess, but would it stand to reason that a +1 is better than a -1?
Oh yeah, yes.
Okay. All right.
All right. If we go back up to this, think of this as standard deviations. All right, and so here is our 0 is considered to be our mean. So anything to the left of that would be below your mean average, anything above. And so what they're telling you is a standard deviation is 2. So anything above 1 standard deviation exceeds growth. Anything below 1 standard deviation means you didn't make growth. You got 1 standard deviation either side for a confidence interval. That's what this is telling you here. And so we know from this chart that the mean is considered to be 0. That would be the middle of your bell-shaped curve. And to the right, 2 is a standard. Anything that's up to from 0 to 2 is 1 standard deviation. So that means it's that you've just met. Anything below 1 standard deviation, you've still met. Anything above 2, it gets into a 2nd standard deviation, which means you've exceeded. Anything below a -2 means that you more than 1 standard deviation and that you didn't meet. They don't just give you an absolute. You have a range. This is the way a bell-shaped curve works with standard deviations.
Dr. Lamb?
So yeah, a +1 is better than a -1.
Dr. Lamb?
Yes, go right ahead.
To Dr. Hamilton's point, Joel, that means you could have 2 teachers that technically met growth. So let's say Danny Stedman had a growth index last year of -1.65, and Ms. Tobias had a positive growth index of +1.65. You're going to have 2 very different conversations with those teachers, even though both made growth. Because you've got one teacher who, yes, you made growth, but you are dangerously close to falling into that not met growth.
That 2nd standard deviation that starts at -2.
Right, versus Ms. Tobias, hey, you know what? You just missed it. positive 1.65 tells me if you had gotten 2, 3, 4 more children to do just a little bit more. And so that's kind of how I frame EVOS conversations with my teachers.
Great. Absolutely, Dr. Crawford, excellent. The 1.65, you're just a couple more kids and you would have exceeded growth. The negative 1.65, a couple more of them guessed wrong, and you wouldn't have, you would have been not making growth. And so you have a different conversation. Zero, that zero in the middle right there, there's a different conversation if you're on the right than if you're on the left. That's exactly right. So it's just like correlation. It's the absolute strength on correlation. It doesn't matter if it's positive or negative. This is not correlation. This is standard deviation. Positive and negative does matter here.
Okay.
Dr. Tobias, I think, sent a message that she has a chart actually that shows what you're talking about.
All right.
I think that's what she was referring.
How can we get to Dr. Tobias's chart?
I'll be after Dr. Crawford because I'm going to talk about high school. What we do with it.
Excellent. So Dr. Crawford, thank you, Dr. Hamilton. And to the question that was asked, that Lanika asked, there may be a reason why. I mean, that would be a conversation with your principal when you say, I didn't make growth, but I had 8 different stay nines in my class I had such a wide range. It was hard for me to differentiate for everyone. And that's why I said different teachers get different results with different kinds of kids. That you put a completely random group in there that represent all 8 stay nines. Ooh, that's a tough gig. And but that goes back to principal developing that master schedule. Who goes what, where, and when. You can't allow teachers to do that. There is a system that we build a master schedule that I'll teach you next semester. But EVOS factors into that. It's one of those 5 things in the scheduling process that we've got to look who gets best results with what kinds of kids. And we can't give them such a wide range that we really can't pinpoint it. 4 is more than enough of the 8 stay nines. Otherwise, we're just guessing. We don't know if who they're good or bad with. We've got to narrow that down. But again, that's a political conversation to have. So let me close this one, and I will go to Dr. Crawford's presentation. Dr. Crawford, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Lamb. So Dr. Hamilton gave you that school level view, that principal view that we all look at, and at some point that you all look at. A couple of years ago, I began having conversations with myself about how to make standard 5 that teachers reflect on their practices a lot more meaningful, and how do we make EVOS data more meaningful for teachers. And so this is a document that I use with my folks. And what I do with it is for those teachers that have EVOS, and I don't think it's been mentioned yet, but you have to have 3 consecutive years as a teacher of scores to generate official state EVOS data. So after 3 years, then you are officially on the clock, as it were, with EVOS data. Mm-hmm. So not every teacher will have that. So that's one of the things you got to look at. So with my teachers, what I do is I give them this form, and the idea is to look at their EVOS data. And just like a lot of the reports that Dr. Hamilton shows you, this shows teachers specifically how to go through their EVOS data to look at subgroups, to look at those subgroups, whether it's ethnicity or whether it's high, middle, and low kids. And as you do this over time, you're going to find teachers that simply do better with certain types of kids. Mm-hmm. I have a 1st grade teacher who, when I looked at her 1st grade data, her data with kids that were above average was horrendous. It just wasn't good. But her data with kids that came to her below average or still hadn't mastered even kindergarten skills was absolutely phenomenal. And she was just experienced and honest enough to say to me, I don't know what to do with kids that come to me that already know what to do. My strength and my passion is with kids that come to me struggling. So you're going to find kids that do well with EL kids. You're going to find teachers that do well with your EC, or my friends in South Carolina, your SPED population.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes to, and that gets into scheduling down the road. So then, had this been a normal year, this would have gone out, teachers would have done that. And then as I am having PDP conferences, beginning of year PDP conferences with teachers, then we use this EVOS data to make and address one of their goals for the year. So if your EVOS data suggested that your students with disabilities, or your Black males, or your Hispanic females, or whatever subgroup, didn't perform as well maybe as you wanted them to, we can take that data, we can make a goal around that so that that teacher keeps that level of growth in mind, keeps specifically those kids in mind as they are practicing and engaging throughout the school year. So for me, this does two things. One, it makes EVOS tangible for teachers, because Dr. Hamilton is correct. Sometimes it's difficult to get teachers to, put in their mind the growth model and not just proficiency. But then it also forces teachers to really make this part of their own professional growth. And then they can make goals, in any of the 5 areas, whether it's teacher leadership, whether it's, what they're teaching, how they're teaching it. Definitely address the standard 5 on being reflective in practice. But I just use this form to give teachers that systematic way to review their EVOS data, and then we review it together in relation to the school data to then make goals for teachers for the school year. So again, it goes back to taking their data, making goals based on their data, and then as the principal, since I have to meet with them mid-year and then have to do the end of year, it also forces me to keep those things in mind for teachers. And if you are ever struggling with, what kind of professional development you do with, say, a high-performing teacher, this is a great way to do that, because they're going to break down that data as well. And I guarantee you, unless they are a teacher that's been blue for 10 years straight, well, then, you got yourself a unicorn. But this is a good way to really have a data-driven conversation with teachers that can, down the road, when you do it in increments, affect your whole school.
Okay. A quick sidebar here. Most people get up and go to work every day, and rather do they say, I think I'll go to work today and be incompetent. Most people try their very best, and they want to do their very best, and they want to be competent. But sometimes you have to have those critical conversations with people about where their strengths and weaknesses are. And for that, sometimes they have to put their ego in check. Sometimes you'll have teachers that have been there so long, their name's on the deed, not only the door, but the deed as well. They've been there so long, and they had certain kinds, they had the high flyers. They had, the doctors, lawyers, Indian chiefs kids, but they may not get good results with those. And so you have to have those critical conversations about, do you want your ego exercised, or do you want performance? And I'm not going to let you just have these best kids because, you can brag over to country club about who you've got. It's all about performance. I want you to be competent. I want you to be successful. Let me help you with that. If you can't self-assess and do that, then the principal has to have that critical conversation about, this is where you get the best scores. Let's get you into an area where you can do your best. And sometimes there's hurt feelings in that, but in the end, you've got to convince your teachers. It's all about, you're trying to make them successful. You're trying to get them in the right seat on the bus. And that's not always an easy conversation to have, but that's what they pay you for. You don't teach a soul. Your job is to make sure that instruction is being delivered at the best it can be, and that you organize the most effectively. And that's why it is number 4 in the hierarchy of how to schedule a school. You've got to have those critical conversations. Thank you, Dr. Crawford. Dr. Tobias, if you got a document that I can bring up or that you can bring up, I can make you host and let you share.
Yeah, if you give me rights to share, I would be happy to do so.
That.
My document is a Durham document, so that's the only reason I couldn't share it. I can't share all of it. I cut enough out of it, but if you will give me rights to share.
Okay, you are now the host. I will stop my share.
I didn't want all that power.
Nah,
I just wanted some power.
There you go.
Thank you. So before I start sharing, what I'm gonna say a little bit about is, as a high school principal, and I have only been a high school principal, so I can only speak to EVOS from that end. And I'm gonna say to this too, that my school is a small school. We have 300 students. We have made 100% growth in all our students for the past 3 years. Our growth scores have been the top 10 in the state in the last 3 years. And I say that because growth is very important to the staff. So they're so groomed now. And I say that as a preface to what I'm going to say next. They're groomed to look at growth. The performance, of course, in the big picture of your school accountability means something, but my staff is so groomed to look at growth. So they will themselves go to EVOS before I do to look at their score, their EVOS data sheet before I get there. So I want to be sure that that we understand that a staff can be taught to understand growth and what that means to students, and particularly our minority students. It's important for us as principals to speak to growth, because it's no sense in having students sit a whole year in a class and they haven't made a whole year's growth, because that's what EVOS is telling you. A minimum of a year's growth is what it's asking for. So I use EVOS twofold. I use it to look at teacher performance, who I want where, and I look at student growth and placement. So I use it for that reason. It is not a self-fulfilling prophecy for me. So when they get their predictions, and I'll get to that in a minute, I always say that ahead of time. That's what Dr. Lamb was kind of alluding to earlier. This is not a prediction to say, well, I have all the dumb kids and they're going to stay dumb. It's not a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is a quick synopsis of what analyzing the EVOS reports. I had it up there for a while. I hope you guys were reading, but that's what you do with some of the reports at some point. This is the chart that you guys were talking about. Oops, let me back it up. In terms of diagnostic. This is an example of they call them the whisper charts. So it will tell you, my teachers look at this first. When they get their report, they pull that up because they want to look at this end, the lowest end and the highest end. The middle is important too. But I have a biology teacher, when they were doing these, he always wanted to see that this end was in the blue more so than this end. So neither is good to be under here. Of course, you can exceed growth and still be at the bottom, but he never wanted his scores for the high or the low to be at this end, because he would take it that he didn't do his job. So I haven't grown them, the low, and I haven't grown the high kids. You want everybody to grow. So it's a visual immediately for teachers to see where their kids are in terms of the high growth and the comparison over years. So this is just basic growth. And of course, this is non-growth. I always say they're going backwards. That would usually be our joke in our school. How could they go backwards? But when you have a graph that goes that far, they're literally going backwards. And that would be of concern to me for a teacher. So my teachers have a tendency to look at the low kids, what have they done with them over time? Their goal is to ensure that all their students are on the up over time, because other than that, you're wasting, you have to evaluate who you are or who you are as a teacher. So it's that crucial conversation that we've all been talking about, that if you're going to use EBOS reports, then you have to be bold enough to have that crucial conversation to say, over time, you haven't grown any kids. Now, when we had this training in our system, we had the training, we could see other people's reports. And unfortunately, for some schools, and we would talk amongst ourselves, honestly, we would talk about like, why would this be for our schools, and that this couldn't be. So if you ever get to see a different school's graph or their teachers, that's something to talk about. So my teachers would always talk honestly to each other. What can we do differently to make the graph look differently? So you could see what we were talking about earlier. They met the academic growth standard for North Carolina. That's where the graph would be. Less than standard, exceed standard, and they met standard for growth, which that's what we were talking about. It could be below sometimes, depending on where you came from, and then not. So, oops, I want to go back and talk about for high school. So high school, we used EOCs. The NC finals generate data, but those aren't, in our growth, they're not in the model that we use. So, and I still use biology. We still use this projection summaries for biology, even though biology is a performance, is not within the growth now. So I still use it though, because my teacher's that, he's just like that. And being in a small school, I have singletons. So you don't have a choice about who you get in the class. If you're the only math teacher, you're gonna get all the math kids. If you're the only biology, so it is what it is. So like last year, because we had no test data, we had to backtrack to the year before. So my incoming freshmen, I don't have current data yet because EBOS doesn't get released usually till October. That's one thing too. That's a little flaw in there. They released it too late. So I always had to backtrack to find data. So for ninth graders, I would have to look to the 7th grade year to get valid data for predictions for how you would do in Math 1. So my predictions are Math 1, English 2, and biology. So we would look at if these would be student names, and then we would look at the predictions. So the prediction said, well, this child has a 90% chance of scoring a level 3 in biology, a 60% chance of scoring a 3. And we would do this in the summer. We would look at the students, we would look at the class. Sometimes it is a placement. Some teachers are good at African-American males. Let's be real, some teachers are not. That doesn't excuse you from having those students in your class, but I'm realistic enough to say, you know what, I'm not gonna hurt a kid. I'm gonna have a conversation with the teacher, but I'm not gonna hurt a kid like that. I know my biology teacher can teach anybody. So we look at the prediction and we put strategies in place in the summer. So people have talked about scheduling. I have an intro to biology class, a biology class. Not all the low kids go into intro to biology. I may start at the 3s down. So you have a good mixture of smart kids or kids that are capable. I don't want all the kids with a prediction score of this to be in one class, because let's be honest, it's not a fun class for a teacher to teach if they have to try to grow that. Or kids need a little bit of interaction with other students. So we use the predictions to decide who will teach what sometimes, and what will my master schedule look like? Because my master schedule may need more intro classes than it may need one semester classes. Sometimes as principals, you have to be savvy enough to know that if you have a whole school of kids that are coming in unprepared, you can't just dump them in a class without helping them along the way. That's the point of looking at the predictions, not for teachers to sit there and say, well, you gave me all the kids that don't have a hill's chance of being to be successful. That's not the answer. The answer is, well, we're going to put something in there, some strategies to aid in their success. So that's what we do with it. We use it for that kind of placement. This just talks about the teachers, what exceeds growth means met growth, and those who do not meet expected growth. When the teachers don't meet expected growth, we have, I think Dr. Crawford talked about having that maybe in your pre-conference or something like that. We also have that conversation. If you didn't meet growth, what is it that you need to do differently for the next year? Over time, I've used EVOS for years. I think I was in one of the first pilot groups when they were piloting it. That's how long I've used it. But I didn't know the model, Dr. Lamb, so thank you for sharing that, because I didn't know how it was calculated. But I've used it for years for high school in terms of appropriately placing kids, creating effective strategies for students to grow them. So, and I've also used it when I want to say, well, maybe we don't want math in the fourth period because that's at 3 o'clock. Maybe, so scheduling, simple thing like that. Kids learn better in the day. So early in the day. So simple things like that. I use it for a vast array of things with scheduling and with knowing exactly where to place teachers, etc. I heard that EVOS is changing, by the way. So I'm not sure what it looks like. That's why they didn't want me to share the PowerPoint, the full PowerPoint, because they didn't know how it was changing, but my folks have said that it is changing somewhat.
How the reports are done is what's changing. The concepts won't change. They're trying to make the reports a little more user-friendly, where folks can get a better understanding. And so a question came in there at the end: what's more important, comparative accountability or composite, your overall score as a school or your growth? Both are important, but understand this, to what Dr. Tobias was just talking about. Your job is to grow every kid. You don't get to pick who you get. Their mama sends the best ones that they have. Your composite or comparative accountability score, a lot of that's based on who you get. Your growth score is what you do with it. And so, yes, we have comparative scores where your school's composite is 70. If you drop below 50, you're low performing, you're at 70. But that's pretty much determined by who you get. Your growth score is an indicator of what you do with the kids that you get. And that's really, if your school composite's at 30, but you're showing growth, you'll be okay. You would love to be above the 50% level, but if you're in a Title I school in High Point, North Carolina, I believe somebody on here is. You get who you get. The issue is not who you get, but what do you do with them? Our job is to teach every child and to do the best. And one of the things that Dr. Tobias was talking about, you have to be careful. If you put all the same level in the class, that's again back to the Bluebirds, Robins, and Buzzards. Y'all aren't old enough to remember that, but that's how we used to ability group for reading in elementary school. We had 3 groups. And you could never break out of that group. That's when we tracked kids, and they live down to our expectations of them. The notion with growth is that we'll find a way to move every kid a year. That may not be the same as some other kid. He might not have learned as much, but for him, he moved a year, and that's what we're trying to do. I hate to use this term, but it goes back to the notion of no child left behind, that every kid matters. There's a lot of negative connotation with that, but it's true. EVOS is about it's about every teacher and every kid. That you can't afford to have bad teachers. You can't afford to have weak teachers. You may, as Dr. Tobias said, you may have some teachers who don't do well with African-American males, but that's a critical conversation you've got to have with them. But you can't punish the kids. You've got to look out for them. And so, and one of the things she mentioned also is, your professional development plan has got to be based around, we got to get better. We got to know our data in our PLCs and disaggregate it. We got to find a way to move these kids or that kid. I mean, that's what your professional growth plan is about. Now, the question was South Carolina. There are some districts on a local plan using EVOS in South Carolina. It is called EVOS there. The state plan in South Carolina is SLOs and MAP data, student learning outcomes. That it's the same thing it's a growth plan as well. But they just use SLOs. Their reporting will look differently. But there are some districts, we had a couple already, that Dr. Stedman and I have had some students whose districts down around Florence, there are some that are trying to maybe move over to EVOS eventually. But the state plan, but it is still SLOs are still a student growth model. It's the same concept. That you've got to move every child, you're trying to grow every child, you're trying to match teachers with students that they have ability to teach. And so that's the notion overall is that you got to dig down in your data, and your data tells you where you need to put your emphasis, back to Dr. Hamilton's presentation, but it also gives you a roadmap going forward of the staff development that you need to do with your staff, which leads us into our next evidence, which is the APTEL, which is about teacher empowerment, which is empowering them to be better leaders in their own classroom. That's, again, Marzano best practices, and giving them the opportunity, those who get good results, to teach others. And that's Todd Whitaker. That's empowerment that's the first level of empowerment as a school leader. So tonight we're making a transition. You should be at a point where you start thinking now of transitioning into the APTEL. And if you can understand some of the concepts that we've talked about tonight, and you read through it, then all of a sudden you're going to say, oh, I understand now why they're having me do a professional development plan. That's going to be the action plan in the next evidence. Oh, we're trying to move a school. We're trying to do staff development that helps teachers meet the needs of students. And it's all about those standardized test scores. We're trying to move those. Because that's whether it's comparative accountability or composite score of your school, or whether it's your growth score. The score is what you're going to be evaluated on as an administrator. Did you move those scores in a positive direction? That's whether it's comparative or growth. It's immaterial in terms of how it's going to be. Your success is going to be based on student performance. Period. Don't hate the player, hate the game. We're just trying to teach you how to play the game. All right.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
So talking about the example or case scenario that Dr. Tobias was mentioning, if I have a teacher who does very well with a subgroup, let's say African-American males, I have another teacher who does poorly. I want that teacher who does poorly to learn from the other.
That is correct.
But at the same time, wouldn't I be doing a disservice to continue to put African-American males with that teacher who does so poorly?
That is correct. That's what Dr. Tobias was talking about.
Can I answer that question?
Yes.
You are doing a disservice to the kids, but you're also doing a disservice to the teacher to not encourage their growth.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why you have to be bold enough to have that conversation and to provide strategies. So that teacher would be observing in that class. If I'm going to go there, you best know that you're going to have a plan that you're in that class, and you're not going to get away with it every year. Sooner or later, you're going to bite the bullet, because we can't pick and choose who goes to school.
That's exactly right. So if you look at, and I know we're a little past our time, and I'm gonna try to be quick here. So if you look at this plan, what you're going to see is we're going to have a mentor for beginning teachers, but we're also going to have a mentor starting second quarter with our low performing teachers as determined by our data. That's what we're talking about. It's a disservice to them to let them continue to be bad. We've got to find a way. We've got to find somebody who's good at that and let them mentor them and work with them. Now, part of that is you're going to have to unbalance your schedule. You know, so Joel is my mentor. I'm trying to learn from him. We can't have planning at the same time. What we're going to do, sit and look at one another. We need to have an unbalanced schedule so that when he's teaching, I can go and watch him because I'm on planning and vice versa. But you owe your staff to work with them and have those critical conversations that are real, and say, you don't do well with this, but we're going to help you get better, or I'll help you find another career. In the business, we call that new ox. Jesus said, if your ox is in the ditch, you can miss church on Sunday. But if your ox is in the ditch every Sunday, you need a new ox. And so after I have given you all this extra help and support, and that's what my plan, you notice down here in yellow, when that doesn't work, and it doesn't take, like those dance lessons I took years ago, when they didn't take, it's action plan time. And then you're not truly a school administrator until you can let good people go who just can't teach. You can't just keep good people because they're good people. If they can't teach, and you've done all you can do, you've set up a professional development plan, you've shown them the data, you've got a mentor, you've worked with them, you put them on an action plan, and they still can't teach, they're hiring over at the post office. That's what they hire you to do. And if you can't do that, again, they're hiring over at the post office for you. They'll give you the opportunity to find a new career. All right, there was the gong that went off. All right, I hope that this has helped you in some way. Continue these conversations with your instructors and your coaches. This is a big part of making that shift from the teacher mentality to the administrator mentality, that you don't teach a soul. Your job is to make sure that the kids get taught. And a big part of that is critical conversations. The heart of it is professional development. You don't always get the best teachers. It's your job to make them the best teachers. We don't want to have to let anybody go. We want our teachers to get better, because if they're better, our kids will get what they need. And in the end, that's what we want. All right. I've had the time of my life. I've never felt this way before. I swear it's the truth. And I owe it all to you. I'll see you next time. Y'all have a good week. Bye-bye.